All right, how's everybody today? Staying warm? The temperature's going to get better than it has been in a while.
Yeah.
Hopefully we'll climb up into the 50s and 60s this week, so you won't need to cap with the fuzzy ball on top there. So what we were doing last time was we were going to finish watching the video on Sagat Metro, but you also had two critical thinking exercises that were due today that are designed to help you think about strategy, and particularly your individual strategy in this class. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by talking about the assignments, the critical thinking weighted averages strategy, so you can figure out your strategy for achieving your maximum grade in this class based on your strengths and weaknesses, which you list your strengths during the first week of class. And then we're also going to talk about how to write the critical thinking article review, and you all have got that to turn in, and then we'll finish watching this video. The critical thinking that I assigned that's posted on D2L for this video will then be due on, do you want to do on Thursday or Tuesday? Tuesday. Oh, you want to work on it over the weekend. Right, I'm not believing that. But we'll pretend, hope springs eternal. I'll make it due on Tuesday. And then we're going to start talking about, we'll finish talking about strategy today, and we'll move into environmental scanning, which is also a part. Again, all of these things come together, and you have to realize how they interplay with each other. So doing an environmental scan and understanding the environment is part of that strategic planning that you're going to do as marketers. So let's see, with regard, I've started the roll sheets. It's going around in the back, so be sure to sign that. And let me see what I did with mine. There we go. Let me see what I did with my critical thinking weighted averages. So let's see, we had one group that got full credit. So I'm going to, you are the leader, the gentleman, you are the leader of the group for that. I'm going to come over here. We'll adjust the camera, and you get to be, let me grab my phone so I can also zoom in.
I want to thank the Academy on behalf of our group for nominating us.
All right, stand up. Now, I told you that they got full credit. They came up with different recommendations than I probably would have. But let's start with, come on, zoom in. Zoom in again. This thing takes a minute to talk between the camera and the thing. All right, so how did you get the score? How did you come up with the score? What was the score that you came up with, first of all? Do you have it?
No, I don't, sir.
You don't have it.
It's framed and it's in our archive.
It's framed and in your archive.
Yes, sir.
Do you-
But what?
Oh, we got it.
Basically, what we did. Sam is going to stand up and talk to this.
Oh, we're delegating authority. That's good. This is a leadership technique. It's called delegation.
All the input was filtered into me, and I basically compiled it and ran their numbers through a sophisticated algorithm. Sam is going to speak up.
Okay.
We'll see. I'm not sure if I had it over here. So the score that I got for the first girl, I think her name was Becky.
Mm-hmm.
She's your little sister. Something like that. Was it? I think it was an 86%, something close to that. And how we did that was I Googled how to find the weighted average, and
You Googled how to do a weighted average, and what did it tell you to do?
it told you to take the score that you get on a test and then multiply it by the decimal percentage of what it would be worth throughout the entire course. So
Okay, so wait a minute. That's one way. So what you could do is you could say, one way that you can do this is you can say the entire category was worth what?
the entire category for test was worth 60%.
Okay, so it's worth 60%. So you can take the averages of all of the exams
And then you could multiply it by 0.6.
and multiply by 0.6. Alternatively, you could say you've got 60 points, and you could take 60 and multiply it times the average, times the decimal. Because of the transitive property of math, you could multiply it that way by the decimal and come up with that. Or you could say each exam is worth 15%, and you could do it that way, right? You could take each exam. All right, so you came up with what she
I
got?
think it was 86%. I don't have it necessarily right in front of me. I'm sure it's here.
I think it was 82.76% is what I got. Did anybody get that? Okay, so without taking the final, she could have gotten an 82.76. All right, so then your recommendations were?
Our recommendations were that you shouldn't take the final because she could only increase her grade by 4.8 points at most if she got 100 on the final. So there's no point in going through that torturous final that you have in store.
So the most she could get with the final, if she made 100% on the final, according to my math, would be an 87.56%. Is that what you all got? Does that sound right? Is that right? That's what I got. The most she could get is an 87.56, which is a what? A B. So she had a B to begin with. She'd end up with, if she did 100, she'd end up with a B. And okay, so what did you put for your what she should do?
Well, those students actually that had terrible grades for the very first test, and then she also did some critical thinking challenges. She did well on the group assignment and her article review. So basically recommended that she show up to class and do the critical thinking and perhaps study more for the first couple of tests.
Okay. All right. Very good. For Rao, what did you recommend?
For Rao, looked like he had perfect attendance. He got everything for the critical thinking challenges. But again, the first 2-3 tests, the grades weren't that great. He scored a 92 on the final, and he even got 15 bonus points. But even with the bonus points, he just got right under an 8 around, 89%.
Okay, his score with the final was what?
88.65%.
88.65%. So you have to know what? What does Raul have to know? What's the most he could have gotten? What's the highest possible score he could have gotten if he got 100 on the final?
Well, he did take the final.
Right, he did, but let's say that he could have, let's pretend that he hasn't taken the final yet. What's the highest score he could have gotten if he'd made 100% on the final? What's the highest score he could? Did anybody figure that? This is what would have given you bonus points on the first go round. Yeah, he would have had an 89.85%. So you would have to know whether or not I round up in order to know whether or not it was even worth it for him to take the final. So you'd have to know if I round. That's not in the syllabus. I will round on an 89.85, I'll round that up. So he had an opportunity to make an A, but without knowing that, what should Raul have done?
Without knowing that,
Yeah, without knowing that.
I didn't calculate the grade that he would have had without taking the final.
His shot at taking a final was a long shot, but go ahead. So what did you all come up with?
Well, I mean, I only calculated the top 4 grades, so I didn't take into account that 56% he got in the first test.
Right, because he did go ahead and take the final.
If I had, it's very possible he could have gotten closer to his C instead of the 7.
You mean closer to an A?
No, I'm talking about if he hadn't taken the final at all.
Oh.
Hypothetical.
Okay.
He was going down.
All right.
If he hadn't taken the final and we're calculating the grade, count the final grade of 92, which I did not calculate, so.
Okay.
Calculation.
All right, so you guys, but you did a good job of going beyond the numbers. Who else wants to share what they came up with? Which other team? Everybody wants to be shy today? Nobody wants to talk? No other team wants to go? Okay, so let's see, I'll turn this back here and then I'll turn it back in a minute. Where's the... All right, so what we want to do is marketing, let's see where the camera's at. Marketing is about making predictions for the future And so what we want to do is we want to take past, a lot of you came up with good past recommendations of what they should do, but we also then want to be able to apply that to future success. So it should be looking forward. So what I came up with for this exercise, nobody else wants to share, is that basically they got full points. They didn't come up with the recommendations that I necessarily would have come up with, because my recommendations would be, there's no way that Rebecca could get an A. So she ought to maximize her utility by doing what? What could you say she could do? She can't get an A in this class, but she could get an A in what? Maybe another class, so maybe you should spend the time, what? Studying for another class. Round without knowing whether or not I rounded up or not is an idiot, because he took the final, and the chances of him getting the A without knowing whether or not I will round are I mean, if you don't know that I'll round, the chances of him getting an A are statistically impossible without the rounding. And so again, he probably shouldn't have taken the final, although if he knows that I'll round, which I'm telling you, if you get an 89.5, I will round that to an A. But don't start with the, if I have an 88, no, 88's not close. But if you get an 89.5 or above, I'll round to the next highest grade. But he could have spent his time better studying for another class, because he still ended up with his score, with taking the final exam and getting the 92 instead of the 56, which replaces it. What was his score? What did you all come up with? It should be an 88.65. Is that what you came up with? Somebody's shaking their head no. You didn't come up with, you got an 88.65? Is that right? You were shaking your head no. Did you not come up with 88.65? You did or you didn't? Okay, all right. You came up with an 88.65, which is not going to be an A. So you can spend your time studying for a class where you're more likely to get an A, or really study for the final and get 100 and hope that you'll get pushed over. All right, so let's talk about the other critical thinking. I'll turn the camera around. Which group wants to tell me what you found for the article review? What was missing? Who wants to go? Don't everybody speak at once.
Conclusion?
Who said that? Stand up. Be a star.
Conclusion?
The conclusion is what's missing. The big part. So what did you all write for your conclusion? What's the conclusion? Yeah, what did you write? What's your conclusion?
Basically that his hypotheses are not backed with concrete facts, and they're all situationally based.
Okay, yeah, I think that's you can flower it up a little bit so that you get a bigger conclusion. But yeah, that there's not enough evidence to support the claims. It's interesting. The claims that he makes are interesting, but it's not necessarily supported by a long-term scientific longitudinal study. And so I think that's what you could have come up with. Anybody else come up with something else? Other groups come up with something else? No one came up with anything else? Yes, ma'am.
Cover page?
Cover page. That's, yeah, I didn't put a cover page on that. What I did is I attempted, so if you found those things, if you found typographical errors, what I was looking for is conclusion, but obviously if you say cover page or something else, I will consider those answers. I did this in such a way as to be able to put it on one sheet of paper. And so initially it was double spaced, but I didn't want to have a huge handout. I'm trying to save paper, so you could have come up with that as something else that's missing. Anybody come up with anything else?
An attachment of the article.
An attachment of the article, okay. Following directions is important. What else? Anything else? No? All right. So let's see if I can come back. There we go. All right, so we need to finish watching the Dr. Meeser film and talk about how we can use this, because what I intimated to you last time was you should focus on this next critical thinking challenge in your response to that is that marketing as a discipline, because it's so new, has borrowed a lot from other disciplines. We borrowed from psychology, we borrowed from economics, we borrowed from sociology, and we can borrow from these other disciplines and learn things and apply them to our own discipline and come up with successful strategies. So let's finish watching the child-driven education, and then we'll finish talking about strategies.
Wikipedia, Ask Jeeves, etc. The teacher said, is this deep learning? I said, well, let's try it. I'll come back after 2 months. We'll give them a paper test, no computer, no talking to each other, etc. The average score when I'd done it with the computers and the groups was 76%. When I did the experiment, when I did the test after 2 months, the score was 76%. There was photographic recall inside the children. I suspect because they're discussing with each other. A single child in front of a single computer will not do that. I have further results which are almost unbelievable of scores which go up with time. Because their teachers say that after the session is over, the children continue to Google further. Here in Britain, I put out a call for British grandmothers after my Coupam experiment. Well, with the very vigorous people, British grandmothers, 200 of them volunteered immediately. The deal was that they would give me 1 hour of broadband time sitting at their homes 1 day in a week. So they did that, and over the last 2 years, over 600 hours of instruction has happened over Skype, using what my students call the granny cloud. Granny cloud sits over there, I can beam them to whichever school I want to.
You can't catch me. You say, you can't catch me. I'm the gingerbread man. Well done, very good, lovely Jack. How about the supreme?
Back at Gates said, a 10-year-old girl gets into the heart of Hinduism in 15 minutes. You know, stuff which I don't know anything about. 2 children watch a TED Talk. They wanted to be footballers before. After watching 8 TED Talks, he wants to become Leonardo da Vinci. It's pretty simple stuff. This is what I'm building now. They're called souls, self-organized learning environments. The furniture is designed so that children can sit in front of big, powerful screens, big broadband connections, but in groups. If they want, they can call the granny cloud. This is the soul in Newcastle. The mediator is from Pune, India. So how far can we go? One last little bit and I'll stop. I went to Turin in May. I sent all the teachers away from a group of 10-year-old students. I speak only English, they speak only Italian. So we had no way to communicate. I started writing English questions on the blackboard. The children looked at it and said, what? I said, well, do it. They typed it into Google, translated it into Italian, went back into Italian Google. 15 minutes later, next question, where is Calcutta? This one they took only 10 minutes. I tried a really hard one then. Who was Pythagoras and what did he do? There was silence for a while. Then they said, you spelled it wrong. It's Pythagora. And then, in 20 minutes, the right angle triangles began to appear on the screen. It just sent shivers off my spine. These are 10-year-olds. So you know what's happened? I think we've just stumbled across a self-organizing system. A self-organizing system is one where a structure appears without explicit intervention from the outside. Self-organizing systems also always show emergence, which is that the system starts to do things which it was never designed for, which is why you react the way you do, because it looks impossible. I think I can make a guess now. Education is a self-organizing system where learning is an emergent phenomenon. It will take a few years to prove it experimentally, but I'm going to try. But in the meanwhile, there is a method available. 1 billion children, we need 100 million mediators, there are many more than that on the planet, 10 million souls, $180 billion and 10 years. We could change everything. Thanks.
Okay, so I'll give you a hint about what you should be thinking in terms of strategy. First of all, this is an extremely informative video in terms of thinking about things like how can we reach customers and create value co-creation. But it's also, this was a marketing pitch. At the end, what did he do? He's asking for something, right? It's a marketing pitch, wasn't it? 1 billion children, 100 million mediators, 10 million souls, self-organizing learning units. So it's a marketing pitch. So think about those kinds of things and what marketers can learn from this kind of video and this kind of interaction in making strategic decisions. One of the things, this is a broad thinking program. One of the things that Theodore Levitt says in his seminal article called Marketing Myopia, which we talked about last time, which is mentioned in your textbook on page 30, is this idea that we don't always see the broad picture. Sometimes we become too focused, and for example, one of the things that he talks about in that is railroad companies. There are not as many railroad companies as there were, and they're not nearly as important as they were back at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, because they thought of themselves as being railroad companies when the broader aspect of what they're involved in is what? Transportation. It's transportation. So you can't just focus on the narrow. One of the things that your text talks about in thinking about this, though, that you have to realize is it talks about diversification analysis. Now, with regard to personal finance, how many of you have had your finance class? Okay, a few of you have had your finance class. With regard to personal finance, there is something that we say in finance is the closest thing to a free lunch that you're going to get. And what is that? What's the closest thing to a free lunch that you get in finance? For those of you who had your finance class. Diversification of your portfolio, of your investment portfolio, is a good thing because it does what? What does diversification of your portfolio do? It reduces what type of risk? What? Well, what type of financial risk does it reduce? Micro or macroeconomic? It reduces microeconomic risk. If one sector, so for example, the stock market is taking a hit in the last few weeks, it's been a roller coaster. If you're diversified, if all of your stocks are in, for example, energy, if your entire portfolio is in energy, what's happened to your portfolio? What's happened to it? It's tanked. So we're going to talk about environmental scanning. We'll start talking about that today. What's happening in the environment with regard to energy? What was gas 2 years ago? It was what? It was expensive. It was over $100 a barrel. Why? There was not enough supply and too much demand. What's happened since then? We've got less demand because of what? What was causing an increase in demand before?
Growing economies.
In particular where?
China.
And the other one? India. Two of the newly industrialized countries were growing, their economies were growing at something like 13% a year, and it was increasing the pressure on the oil supply. Then, what's happened since then in the world economy? China has slowed its growth. What else has happened? The Saudis have kept pumping, and we just signed a deal with Iran, which has led to them being allowed to sell their oil on the market, and oil floats on a world market, and so it is what? It's flooded. The price of oil is largely predicated on the last barrel needed. If you have one barrel too much in production, the price tanks. If you have one barrel too few, the price spikes. And so we've seen a glut in the market that's creating instability in the markets and uncertainty. And so particularly in the oil sector, one of the things that's affected all these other stocks is the fact that what's going to happen and what's happening here in Oklahoma, and this is part of, again, how strategic planning goes in with what we'll talk about in terms of environmental scanning, understanding this environment, what's happening to the oil economy and the economy in Oklahoma in particular.
People are getting let go of their jobs, and oil rigs are being shut down.
Yeah, Chesapeake has laid off lots and lots of people. Devon is doing what?
Laying off more people.
Yeah. They've just announced a huge layoff at Devon, and Sandridge is laying off people, and it's affecting the economy, and so this is creating some instability. Now, it's not clear as to what will happen overall. It may be very bad for Oklahoma, but low oil prices could be good for other sectors of the economy, couldn't they? How could they be good for other sectors of the economy? And thinking about this in terms of environmental scanning and strategic planning. What? Freight transportation, which means that the goods that you buy are going to be what? Cheaper. If the price of transporting those goes down, those goods will be cheaper, which means that you then what? You can buy more stuff. You can go more, you can travel more. If the price of flights tanks, what are you going to do? How many of you are going to go on spring break this spring? Where are you going? You're going to Colorado? Is that what you said? Colorado? Why Colorado? Okay. Go skiing, that's a big popular thing to do on spring break, is go skiing in the mountains. Who else has traveled? They will. They'll go down. I mean, it takes some time in the market for the lag to catch up, but eventually, you know, if oil stays cheap long enough, the prices will fall. There will be more pricing wars. It may mean that more people will be able to drive. Certainly, I can tell you that so I have a large boat, and on the lakes, when gas prices were $5 at the marina for gas, what was happening on the lakes? There was a whole lot of people that were sitting on their boats and not going out doing the wakeboarding and the skiing and things like that. A lot of jet skis, which take an enormous amount of fuel, you know, were sitting there. I did this with my nieces and nephews. I said when gas prices were $5 or close to $5 a gallon, and they were more than that at the lake, I said, I'll buy one tank of gas for the weekend for the wave runner, and that's it. You can run, I mean, they can run through 2 or 3 tanks of gas in a weekend. It's got a 25-gallon tank, and so those kinds of things, you know, may mean that people are doing more, traveling more, spending more, and other things, and it could be good for other sectors. But right now, it's uncertain, and so the markets are reacting to this. And if you are diversified, the impact on your overall, if you had all of your funds in energy stocks right now, you're going to be really hurting. But if you diversify, and what may happen to some of these energy companies if you are totally invested in nothing but that sector is they may totally be gone. Chesapeake may completely crash. In which case, if that's your entire stock portfolio, and this happened with Enron, and those people that were totally invested in Enron, particularly their own employees, whose 401ks were invested in that, They were left holding the bag, and what is Enron even around today? No, it's gone. That stock is, gone, evaporated, worth nothing. So you minimize microeconomic risk by diversification of your portfolio. However, with regard to businesses, diversification is less clear that it's a good thing because you're not actively managing the companies that you invest in. But companies are having to actively manage their own product lines and strategic business units, and so diversification is not necessarily a good thing because you may not be an expert in the field that you're going into. And this happened a lot with mergers and acquisitions in the 1990s. Companies were buying and merging and taking on things that they didn't have the expertise to manage actively. So diversification is not necessarily a good thing in terms of business. The Boston Consulting Group has come up with a business portfolio analysis, which is based on your looking at your product lines and determining where you have competencies. And so it forms a 2x2 matrix. And this is in your textbook on page 36. You have a 2x2 matrix where you have high and low. High and low. So you have 4 quadrants based on the 2 axes, which are growth potential and market share. Page 36. So the market growth rate and market share. Market share is on the horizontal axis. Growth is on the vertical. If you have high growth potential and high market share, that's called a star. What do you have to do with stars? What does the text say you should do in your analysis? So what would be a star product for a company? Let's think about Apple. What do you think is Apple's star product? The iPhone? You think the iPhone is their star product? Okay, let's suppose that they have high market share. Is there necessarily high growth though in the cell phone market? You're shaking your head no. You don't think there's high growth?
Not for the iPhone.
Not for the iPhone? Why don't you think that there's no high growth there?
They don't have much options for change. Because every time they do, everyone freaks out about it because they make a change towards Apple only. You only have Apple headphones for the new iPhone coming out. And they're trying to make everything so specifically Apple that people are getting scared about it.
Okay. All right, so you might argue that their ability to maintain market share is decreasing. But let's talk about in the industry as a whole, is there potential room for growth in the cell phone industry itself? Or is it a low growth area in the United States at this point? You think it's high growth?
Yeah.
How are we going to add new users to the cell phone? 5 years ago, I'm not saying you're wrong, but 5 or 10 years ago, that may have been more true than it is today. Does anybody not have a cell phone today? What? Does anybody in this room not have a cell phone? So where are we going to grow? Where's the growth potential?
New technology or something.
What?
Like new technology, like newer, easier technology.
Okay. What? Other countries could present, yes, there could be high, although everybody in this room probably has a cell phone, there are still lots of countries around the world, so there's lots of potential for growth in those places, particularly the newly industrialized countries. So there might be market growth there. Apple has a fairly high share of the market, so that may be a star. Or it may be a cash cow in this country. Because they have high market share, but there may not be a lot of growth in the United States for cell phones. Who still has the potential? Everyone of your generation is going to have a cell phone for the most part, but where do you have potential in growing the cell phone industry?
Older adults.
With what?
Older adults.
Yeah, you could develop that market with older adults who don't necessarily embrace technology and or slower to embrace it. So you might see growth potential there. So we might say the iPhone is high growth. So we might say that for Apple. We might say that that's a star. We can make an argument. I may make an argument that it's a cash cow because I'm not sure how much growth there is left in the United States. But we'll go with the argument that it's a star. What do you suppose is a cash cow for Apple? Maybe doesn't have high growth potential. What about go ahead.
iPods.
The iPod. I think that definitely could be a cash cow. Why is an iPod maybe a cash cow and not a star?
The technology has kind of been assimilated into the iPhone.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's absolutely true. When the iPod first came out, a lot of people had it because the cell phone didn't have all of the stuff, but how many of you have an iPod and a cell phone now? A few of you. How many of you have just started using your cell phone as your digital media when you go to the gym? So yeah, that could be a cash cow. What would be over here in this quadrant is dog or dogs. Does Apple have any dogs? What you want to do with dogs is divest them. Does Apple have any of those that you could argue is a dog product? What about desktop computing? Is that Apple has very low share of the desktop. Who has the majority of the share of the desktop computing? It's some kind of Windows-based product, either Dell or Hewlett Packard or something like that. Does Apple have a huge share of desktop? It may be a cash cow for them. I don't know. Are desktops going to continue? One of the things that they've argued is that we'll get rid of desktop computing and everybody will just go to a tablet. I'm not sure that that's true because it's harder to see. Although if the device had enough memory and storage that you could keep it and transfer it and then just plug it into a docking station where you could then have access to the full keyboard, that might be a potential. But you might argue that their desktop computing is not doing so well, and it may either be a cash cow or a dog. Over here are what they call question marks. What would be a question mark for Apple? I think the Apple Watch is clearly an example of what could be a question mark. It could be really, really great, but we don't know. I mean, they're the first ones to sort of come out with this that will do all of these things, but what are some of the problems with it that people are having? What?
It dies really fast.
It dies, the battery dies really fast. Most people are not used to having to charge their watch every night, and it dies really fast. What else?
You get a text message, your wrist is vibrating.
Uh-huh.
Annoying.
Yeah. Is it really all that functionally wonderful? You're shaking your head no. Why don't you think it's...
I mean, you can't really text on it or anything. Like,
You can't text on it.
A lot of the things that you probably want to do with that technology, there's just you have your phone for it.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the thing. One of the things that's interesting about your generation is that you don't wear watches. And why don't you wear watches? Yeah, why the hell would you wear a watch? You've got your phone. Why do you need a watch? Right? Why would you need a watch? You've got this phone. You don't need it. It's a superfluous article that you don't need because you got this phone. And so, given the fact that you probably have your phone, how many of you become incredibly nervous when you lose your phone or you leave your phone somewhere? How many of you start jonesing for the phone? One of the things that's happening as a result of cell phone technology, and again, because it triggers the pleasure part of our brain when it goes off, when we get text messages, one of the things that's happening is that people are now having phantom phone vibrations. How many of you have had that happen to you, where you think your phone is going off? And so, I don't know, this watch is really a question mark, because how often are you going to be without your phone? And the idea is that it syncs with your phone, and does so. I think that's absolutely right. I think it's a question mark there in terms of the strategy. for it, and whether or not they're going to be able to develop it. So the strategic marketing process beginning on page 38, it starts with, and one of the things that I had you do at the beginning of class is to talk about your strengths so that you can come up with a team name, right? So this is to help you integrate all of this theory into practice. That's what we're doing, and there's a term for that that they've come up with in academics that's called praxis. It's the intersection of practice and theory. And so I had you come up with your strengths. Now, one of the things that you're going to do when you start the planning process is you're going to do a SWOT analysis: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Two of these things are internal to you as an individual if you're practicing this for yourself, and two are external. And if you are a firm, if you're thinking about this from a firm perspective, two of these things are internal to the firm, and then two of those things are external. So what are the internal things that are internal to the firm of the analysis? Strengths and weaknesses. Those are internal. Now, one of the things that you have to be very careful about, and that's difficult to do in doing a strengths and weaknesses analysis, or that part of the analysis, is really being honest. A lot of times we delude ourselves in what I call our own functional fictions. Those are those things that help us get through the day that are not necessarily maybe true. And so you have to be very, very clear about what it is. Where are your strengths and what are your weaknesses? And then the opportunities and threats, those are in the environment. Those are external. So what are the opportunities? Let's think about this. And threats, for example, in the world, since we were talking about Apple. What is Apple's strength, do you think? What is their strength?
They're a well-known brand.
They're a well-known brand. They've got a very good brand name. They're also what?
Their customers are like really loyal.
Their customers are really loyal. That's an external, so that's an opportunity. Why is it that this product is more expensive than the other products on the market? She's got a MacBook right here that I'm pointing at. What makes the MacBook better than, say, another laptop computer? It's reliable. They're really well made. What else? Apple was one of the first in their MacBooks to put in what? What kind of drives? Solid state drives. So that's something that is a strength. They've done really good on technological development. What's a weakness of Apple? Yes, ma'am.
They don't use like super engineering. A lot of their programs don't run on there.
They're what?
A lot of like I don't really know what to call it. A lot of programs that are used for more technical things they don't run on Apple.
Okay. Yeah, iOS has been they've been very strict about what they'll let on and the proprietary nature of it, so that could be a weakness. What are some opportunities then in the computer industry? Where are there opportunities? What? Okay, advertising. There are opportunities also in development in newly industrialized countries and advertising. What are some threats to that industry? Competition, obviously, is a threat. What else is a threat to that industry?
Country espionage.
Okay, corporate espionage could be a threat, and that's becoming a big deal in the contemporary era. And so doing this kind of analysis provides you with an overview for your company. After you do the planning, you need to implement. So you do the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. You decide what you're going to produce, goal set, and then develop a marketing program. Then you have to implement it. What do you need for implementing? Well, you need resources. Everything that businesses do costs money. And you can tell what a business really prides itself on in terms of where they allocate resources. And that's also true in terms of nonprofits as well. Resource allocation is enormously important. You can tell what the goals of an organization are by where it's willing to put its money. At the University of Central Oklahoma, we're going to find out whether or not the university is really committed to us getting an advanced type of accreditation called AACSB on whether or not they're willing to fund that initiative, because it costs money. Everything that you do as an organization is going to cost money. Even just turning on the lights in this building costs money, doesn't it? And so it's a resource allocation process that's necessary. So obtaining resources, designing the marketing organization, developing production schedules, and then executing it. And then you finally have to have that evaluation and feedback loop. If something's not going well, you need to do what? The great thing, one of the things that's great about planning is that you are more successful if you plan, but if you are so rigid and you don't use any feedback, what can happen to you ultimately if you don't respond? Why do you think Apple, after Steve Jobs died, decided that they were going to release an iPad mini? Jobs said he was never going to do it. Apple did it when he died. Why? They're responding to changes in the environment with people wanting that and demanding it because smaller tablets are coming out. So you have to evaluate and then correct for what you see in the marketing environment. All right, so we need to talk about environmental scanning, chapter 3. Any questions on strategies? Okay, environmental scanning. Understanding what type of situation we're in and the environmental forces. And again, one of the things that you have to think about when we talk about environmental scanning, and you use this in your planning process, is that these forces, and what I'm going to give you is an example of how these forces are not necessarily, again, mutually exclusive silos. So you can't just think of them. There are 5 forces that your text lists on a nice diagram on figure 3.2 on page 65. If you have this version of the text, there's social, economic, technological, competitive, and regulatory. And although we think of these as distinct, they oftentimes have enormous overlap. And so I'm going to give you an example of how these sort of forces come together and overlap in the environment that you have to think about. So let's start with social forces. If we went back in time, so we're going to talk about history, to the 1950s, this country was engaged in and in the middle of a great struggle. And what was that struggle?
Cold War.
Okay, we had the Cold War. Internally, what kind of struggle were we engaged in the 1950s? What?
Discrimination.
Discrimination. Segregation. Right? This was a social force or social or cultural phenomenon in the United States, in that we had, after a case called Plessy versus Ferguson, which is regulatory, we had de facto segregation in this country. So after the Civil War, we get 3 amendments to the United States Constitution. The 13th, which frees the slaves. The 14th, which contains one of 2 due process clauses in the document, in the United States Constitution. The first, and these make good bonus questions, the first due process clause is found in the 5th Amendment to the United States Constitution. The second due process clause is found in the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution. And the 14th Amendment also includes the Equal Protection Clause in the document. So after the Civil War, we get the 13th, which frees the slaves, the 14th, which contains 1 or 2 due process clauses in the Constitution and the Equal Protection Clause, and then the 15th Amendment, which provides for the now freed men the right to vote. So So you cannot be denied the right to vote based on your condition of previous servitude or race or creed or things like that. However, did it include the right to vote for women? No, women don't get the right to vote until the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution. So we get this legal precedent, which then impacts the social environment, because in Plessy versus Ferguson, the United States Supreme Court says, well, okay, we've got these new amendments to the Constitution, we've got these people that are now free, but if you treat them equally, you can separate them, so long as there is rough parity. And so we get, as a result of that decision in the Plessy case, de facto segregation throughout the American South, which means, or I'm sorry, we get de jure, I just spoke. That's you can count this as the first time in history I've made a mistake. We get de jure segregation, which means by law, segregation throughout the South in the United States. All sorts of things are segregated. Public schools are segregated. Facilities in terms of restaurants, hotel accommodations, swimming pools are all segregated. Water fountains. They're segregated by law. In 1953, the NAACP, which is a social movement, a social group, and a political action group, decides that it's time to challenge head-on this de jure segregation in public instruction. They had challenged this concept around the margins, and Oklahoma was actually one of the places where it was challenged, because they said, okay, you've got this idea in Plessy versus Ferguson of separate but equal, but Oklahoma, you're not providing equality, because we weren't providing equality in terms of higher education, and specifically in post-baccalaureate education. So we were providing higher education in a segregated system with which institution in the state? It's one of the historically black colleges and schools across the nation. It's what? Langston University. But Langston didn't have a law school. And so the NAACP challenges this in Oklahoma, and they say, you need to start admitting people to the University of Oklahoma's law school because you don't have a law school. And the state said, oh, what we'll do is we'll provide for them to go to a law school in another state. And the court says that's not good enough. You can have separate but equal, but you have to make it equal. And so they decided in Oklahoma that we would have a law school, and they put together a law. It was in the basement of the state capitol the state capitol complex. It had no faculty. It had no law library. And so the courts again said that's not separate but equal. You have to do something that's equal. And so they were forced to admit African Americans to our law school. And there are famous civil rights activists. Ida Samuel in Oklahoma, who was one of our first African American lawyers to graduate, and became sort of a national icon. Well, the NAACP finally decides that it's time to challenge segregation head on and take it on in primary and secondary education. And there was clearly no doubt that in the South that there were complete primary and secondary educational systems with regard to K through 12 education in terms of schools. And the NAACP says, well, okay, it's time to, we've got these precedents where we're saying you have to have separate but equal and you're not. It's now time to take on the challenge head on. And they file a case called Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. And it's actually a consolidated case that's heard by the Supreme Court. In 1954, when the case is heard, Fred Vinson is Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. And 5 votes are clearly there to sustain Plessy versus Ferguson in the Brown case. And then an extraordinary thing happens. In the middle of the court's, after oral arguments have been heard in the Brown case, but before the decision has been released, and that's the way it works at the Supreme Court level, they hear arguments and then they wait and give you a decision several months afterwards. It's not like a trial court where you go to trial and you have your trial and you get a guilty or innocent verdict or whatever, in a very short order. In the Supreme Court, they wait a long time. And Fred Vinson dies before the decision in the case is announced. And a remarkable character rises to the occasion. And his name is Earl Warren. And Earl Warren had been a very popular Republican governor in the state of California. And Eisenhower wanted to run for president, and he had promised Earl Warren if he would throw his support to him. The way you get to become president, you're going to find this out as we go through the election process into the fall, right, is, well, you have to win the party's nomination, and then the two party candidates compete against each other in a general election. And sometimes we have a third party candidate. That may happen this time. There may be a third party candidate that would take away from the Democrats, and that's Michael Bloomberg is considering a run for president. And Donald Trump has sort of said if he's not treated fairly, whatever that means, he's going to run maybe as a third party candidate, and he would take support away from the Republicans. But normally we have two candidates of the major parties, the Republicans and the Democrats. Warren is a popular former governor, and so if he throws his support to Eisenhower, he's from a big state in California, and that's the way you get the nomination, is by getting delegates at the convention. That would give Eisenhower the support to get the nomination, and he promises Warren a seat on the United States Supreme Court. Fred Vinson dies, and Warren says, I want my seat. And Eisenhower says, well, I didn't mean the Chief Justiceship, I meant an Associate Justiceship. And he said, no, you said the first vacancy. And so Eisenhower appoints Earl Warren to the court. And he's an extraordinary individual. Nothing in his past would have suggested that he would rise to the occasion. In fact, during World War II, Earl Warren, as governor of California, had participated in the internment of Japanese Americans along the coast into concentration camps. A really dark spot on our nation's history. But he gets on the Supreme Court and he decides he's going to vote against sustaining Plessy versus Ferguson. And this is, when you have a precedent, it's called stare decisis, which means let the decision stand. And he decides he's going to overturn precedent. And one by one, he goes to the members in the minority. So the decision now is going to be 5-4 to overturn Plessy versus Ferguson. One by one, he goes to the members in the minority and he says, this is such an important decision that we need a unanimous court on this. And the last holdout on that court is a justice named Stanley Reed. And Stanley Reed is a staunch segregationist. And Warren says, Stan, are you willing to sacrifice the reputation of the court for your position which history won't support? And Stanley Reed changes his vote. And Warren gets a 9-0 vote in favor of overturning Plessy versus Ferguson in public accommodations. And in the Brown decision, we get the end of segregation in public facilities. But that's not the end of the story, right? So this movement, which is a social movement, now has political and regulatory implications in that we now have to desegregate all of these institutions that are provided by government. And this really gives rise and impetus to the NAACP to keep up. But we still have segregation in non-public facilities. We still have de jure segregation in non-public facilities in things like restaurants, hotels, and other places that are privately owned, clubs. And again, a remarkable figure comes to answer the challenge that is presented through this legislation. John F. Kennedy becomes president in 1960, and he's assassinated in Dallas. And you can go see the Texas School Book Depository, where they say Lee Harvey Oswald hid out and shot the president. And it's not clear that Kennedy could have gotten the civil rights legislation that he advocated passed, because he was kind of a weak president, actually, but he had a very strong vice president who becomes president. He's a remarkable character. His name is Lyndon Baines Johnson. He's from Texas. He's from the South. And it was going to take someone like Johnson to pass the civil rights legislation that got passed. But in 1965, we get the Civil Rights Act, which ends as a result of Kennedy's death and Johnson pushing it through, segregation in public accommodations that are privately owned, things like hotels, restaurants, bars, movie theaters, and the works. And this is challenged in 2 Supreme Court cases. And the reason that they're able to do this is through something called the Interstate Commerce Clause, which is found in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 of the United States Constitution. The United States Constitution provides in this article that Congress has the ability to regulate commerce with foreign nations, among the various states and Indian tribes. Intra-state commerce is left to the regulation of the states. Now, what Congress does in the Civil Rights Act of 1965 is it says that segregation in accommodations that are privately owned but open to the public is impacting interstate commerce. And therefore, Congress has the ability to regulate it and desegregate it. And 2 cases come out of that. One is called Heart of Atlanta Motel. Versus the United States in 1965. And the other is called Katzenbach. Markers going out. Let's see if this one's any better. Versus McClung. These are sister cases. And so what happens is, after the Civil Rights Act is passed in 1965, and then we also get the Voting Rights Act passed, these businesses challenge the applicability of Congress's ability to regulate private industry through the Interstate Commerce Clause. Heart of Atlanta Motel was a motel. It was not part of a chain like Marriott or Holiday Inn that we have today. It was a single proprietor hotel in the middle of Atlanta, and they only rented rooms to white people. And they said, look, our business is wholly located within the state of Georgia. It doesn't involve interstate commerce, and therefore you cannot regulate us. Can you not read it? Which can you not read? The one on the bottom, it's Katzenbach, Katzenbach versus McClung, M-C-C-L-U-N-G. I know my handwriting is pretty poor. After you go through law school and a PhD program, your handwriting gets really, really, really bad. So the Heart of Atlanta Motel says, look, we're wholly within the state. And what do you think the Supreme Court says to that? Are they involved in interstate commerce? Huh? They're a motel. Yeah, like people stay from other states. They might come in and stay from some. I mean, like you're probably not ready. How many of you like stay in a hotel in Oklahoma City? Not a lot. Why? You live here. Why the hell would you pay for a hotel room when you live here? Although, you know, sometimes when the economy's bad, you might consider doing a staycation instead of staying here and stay downtown in Oklahoma City, the Skirvin, go out in Bricktown. It's kind of fun. I walk around Oklahoma City and I look like a tourist because when I was growing up here, and I say this as someone who dearly loves the great and sovereign state of Oklahoma, Oklahoma City was the ugliest town on the planet. I mean, it was kind of a big cow town. And I love Oklahoma, but Oklahoma City was not much to talk about. And you walk around Bricktown now, and you look at the sculpture, the land run sculpture that we have downtown, and it's absolutely incredible. And the river walk, and the Oklahoma trails that we've got, and the Oklahoma River, where we now have the largest straight body of water for rowing in the nation. And that's pretty impressive, and so I think that's something to really be proud of that we have here in Oklahoma. But, you know, most people don't stay in their hometown. Most people travel and they go stay in hotels. And so the court says, look, you're involved in interstate commerce because not all of your business comes from within the state of Georgia. Katzenbach versus McClung involves Ollie's Restaurant, which is a little barbecue joint that is not near an interstate highway. It's off the beaten path, and it's frequented only by locals. They only allowed whites in the dining room, and they had carry-out for African Americans at the back door. Years later, after arguing cases before the Supreme Court and having become the first African American justice on the United States Supreme Court, Thurgood Marshall recounts an incident with Sandra Day O'Connor when they were debating a civil rights case to illustrate his point. And she writes about this in her book called Majesty of the Law. And she says, Marshall came up to me and he was talking to me about how we needed to, uphold this piece of civil rights legislation that was being challenged in terms of affirmative action. And he says, Sandra, do you know, I used to practice law in the South. And he says, I was representing a man who was accused of murdering, a black man who was accused of murdering a white man in a city in Georgia. And I was going down on the train, and I got off the train, and I went to get some food. And it said colored, rear entrance only. So that's how we did it back in those days, because the front door was just so inconvenient. And he recounts being told by a sheriff who said, what are you doing here, boy? This is a guy who's an attorney. He says, I'm getting some food because I'm on my way to defend a client. He says, the last train leaves here at 4:45, and you'd better be on that train. That's the world we had in the 1950s and 60s. And Ollie's Barbecue is indicative of that. And the court looks at this and says, well, I think you're involved in interstate commerce because where did you get your ketchup packets from? What's the #1 ketchup manufacturer in the country? Heinz. And who's the heir to the Heinz fortune? Teresa Heinz Carey, whose husband ran for president. You got your ketchup packets from somewhere else. They're produced in New Jersey. Where did you get your meat? Oh, it didn't all come from Georgia. Where did you get your tables, your linen? All of that travels in interstate commerce. And I'm about out of time, so we'll finish this next time. Your article, the article review part, and your, I need the response to the critical thinking on the weighted averages, and then the one from the Dr. Fisher video will be due a week from today, and I will hopefully have set up a blackboard so that you can drop it into a Dropbox for that. All right?